They say death is final. But in the summer of 1878, 4 brothers in Kansas proved otherwise, and what they became still defies medical science to this day. This isn't folklore. This isn't fiction. This is a buried chapter of American history, sealed away by the Kansas State Medical Board, erased from church records, and denied by every institution brave enough to examine it. In a time when typhoid fever swept through Harper County like a judgment from heaven, claiming dozens of lives in mere hours, the Blackwood brothers didn't just survive, they changed. Their transformation was so disturbing, so inhuman, that 3 doctors refused to put their names on the report. One of them fled the state and never spoke of it again. Tonight, we're reopening the sealed file. We'll step inside a world where faith collided with biology, where the line between man and divine mutation vanished forever. If you believe you've seen everything on this platform, you haven't heard this. What if I told you there's a forgotten case buried in state archives that medical science still refuses to acknowledge because it would force us to redefine what it means to be human? In the summer of 1878, 4 brothers from Cedar Ridge, Kansas didn't just survive one of the deadliest typhoid outbreaks in American history, they transcended it. And what they became was so disturbing, so unclassifiable, that the Kansas State Medical Board sealed the report indefinitely. Churches purged their names from the record. Witnesses changed their stories. Doctors walked away from their careers. But the paper trail never fully disappeared. For the past 11 months, I've been piecing together the suppressed fragments, letters, forgotten journal entries, censored public health documents, and one first-hand account smuggled out by a man who would never speak of it again. The case of Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood isn't just the most unsettling rural mystery you've never heard of. It's a story about the moment 4 ordinary men stepped outside the boundaries of natural law and never came back. Some called them saints. Some called them monsters. All we know is this: after August of 1878, they were no longer like the rest of us. If you've ever asked yourself how far faith can carry a man, or what happens when that faith begins to reshape flesh and blood, this story is for you. It's not just a ghost story. It's not just a medical anomaly. It's a transformation tale that tears apart the veil between belief and biology. In the following investigation, you'll hear eyewitness reports that were never meant to surface, medical notes that were burned on the orders of a church elder, and transcripts that mention concepts no medical textbook has ever defined. You'll also hear what became of the little girl who walked into the brothers' chapel and came back different. But let me warn you, this story doesn't resolve. It lingers. It infects. It's one of those rare accounts that doesn't just disturb the mind, it unsettles the soul. So if you're the kind of person who can't look away from the dark corners of history, the kind who believes some truths are worth the nightmare, then stay with me. Because once we open the file, we can't unsee what's inside. You've probably never heard of Cedar Ridge, Kansas. That's by design. The town barely existed to begin with, just a wind-beaten patch of prairie in Harper County with fewer than 300 residents and a single dirt road splitting it in half. There were no newspapers, no telegraph station, no doctor until 1875. It was the kind of place history forgot on purpose. But in the summer of 1878, Cedar Ridge became the epicenter of a medical mystery, so profound it shook the foundations of what people believed about life, death, and everything in between. The Blackwood file doesn't begin with the brothers, it begins with a body. July 16th, 1878. The coroner's note describes rapid onset fever, waxy skin, spontaneous rigor mortis within minutes of death. That's not how typhoid works. That's not how any disease works. The woman, Sarah Hartman, 42 shopkeeper, was healthy that morning, dead by midnight. Her eyes refused to stay shut. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county's only licensed physician at the time, noted in his private journal that her skin felt preserved, not decaying, as if whatever had taken her wasn't interested in rot, but in permanence. And then it spread. By the end of that week, 14 more residents were dead, all within 24 hours of their first symptom. The infection pattern made no sense. Entire households vanished, while their closest neighbors remained untouched. No one understood why. No one had time to. Because that was when the Blackwood brothers came forward. 4 devout, reclusive men living on the outskirts of town, who hadn't shown their faces in weeks. And not only were they untouched by the plague, they offered to help. That's where the official records stop. Everything beyond that point comes from recovered letters, hidden church documents, and a medical report that was pulled from the state archives and sealed indefinitely. But the most chilling detail before the file was sealed. Someone underlined a phrase in red ink, scrawled across the bottom of the last page. It reads, "Subjects exhibit signs of biological divergence. Recommend suppression." If that phrase alone doesn't make your skin crawl, keep watching. Because what happened next wasn't just unexplainable. It was unacceptable to the world we thought we lived in. The first time Josiah Blackwood laid hands on the sick, it didn't look like faith. It looked like a deal. August 10th, 1878. Cedar Ridge was choking in grief. The streets were silent, windows boarded, families burying loved ones in their own yards because the churchyard was full. And then, without warning, Josiah appeared at the home of Thomas Fletcher, the town blacksmith. His 8-year-old son, Timothy, had fallen ill the night before violent fever, unconscious, near death. Morrison had already been there. He'd left with no hope. The boy wouldn't last the night. And yet Josiah walked through that door like a man on an errand from God. Witnesses said he didn't knock. He just entered, sat beside the child's bed, and placed both hands on the boy's forehead. And then he prayed. But not like anyone in Cedar Ridge had ever heard. His voice carried across the house, low and resonant, layered like a choir speaking from a single throat. "If this child must suffer, then let that suffering pass through me and my brothers," he said. "Let us become what he cannot survive. Let us wear his pain, and in doing so, let him live." And something happened. Timothy's fever broke. His eyes fluttered open. He asked for water. Less than an hour later, he was sitting upright, laughing. He survived. But Josiah did not walk out the same man who walked in. Thomas Fletcher would later say the room had changed temperature. The shadows moved differently. Josiah's skin looked flushed, too flushed. And his pupils, once pale blue, now shimmered with gold flecks that seemed to shift and swim. Morrison was called to examine both the boy and Josiah that same night. The doctor couldn't explain what he saw. Timothy's vitals were perfect, no sign of infection. But Josiah, he was burning with fever himself, and yet spoke in complete clarity, as if pain no longer applied to him. "This is not illness," he told Morrison. "This is purification." That night, he returned to the farm and told his brothers it was time. Over the next 48 hours, the 4 Blackwood men visited nearly every infected household. They did not bring medicine. They brought only prayer, and healing followed. But with every visit, with every touch, the brothers began to look less like farmers, and more like something in between. Something watching, listening, calculating. Something that didn't belong here. Not entirely. What if healing isn't always a blessing? What if it's an invitation to become something else? The town called it a miracle. But miracles don't come with symptoms. By August 12th, nearly a dozen sickbeds had gone quiet, not from death, but from recovery. The fever broke in every home Josiah entered. Children who had been writhing in delirium were up and speaking within hours. Elders on the brink of death were eating soup by nightfall. The Blackwood brothers didn't ask for thanks. They didn't speak to the families. They arrived, prayed, and left. But the air always felt colder after they were gone, and people started to notice strange things. It began subtly. Ezra's voice started echoing even outdoors. Abel's shadow stretched longer than his body, no matter where the sun was. A girl at the Patterson farm claimed she saw Caleb standing completely still in the wheat field for over an hour. Not blinking. Not swaying. Just watching the clouds with eyes that didn't reflect the sky. And then there were the animals. Horses refused to go near them. Dogs whimpered and ran. Cattle stared but didn't move. Something had shifted. Whatever they had taken in during these blessings, it wasn't just fever. It was something deeper. Something elemental. Doctor. Morrison visited the farm unannounced that week. He found the brothers working like always, harvesting wheat, repairing fence posts. But when he tried to take Josiah's temperature, the mercury shattered. "We've stopped measuring time that way," Caleb said. Morrison would later write in his journal that Abel's pupils had become opalescent like liquid pearl under candlelight. When asked how he was feeling, Abel responded with a calmness that chilled the doctor to his core. "We're adjusting. We don't sleep as much now, and food feels optional." Optional. The word stuck with him. Not because it was unnatural, but because it was said with absolute peace. These weren't men battling illness. These were men surrendering to something larger. Something that was rewriting their biology from the inside out. "It's not disease," Josiah said. "It's alignment." And alignment with what? That's what no one could answer. Because the deeper the town looked, the more they saw something they couldn't explain, only fear. The fever had been their crisis. But the Blackwoods were quickly becoming their apocalypse. And no one knew how to stop something that insisted. It was saving them. By the morning of August 14th, the town had started to whisper a different kind of prayer, not for deliverance, but for understanding. Because what had begun as miraculous healing was now beginning to feel like something else. The Blackwood brothers were changing, and not just in spirit. Their bodies were speaking a different language. Caleb's skin had begun to show strange markings, delicate, rose-colored patterns that looked like equations etched into flesh. They shimmered slightly under lamplight, rearranging themselves in ways no one could explain. Josiah, always the most learned of the four, had stopped speaking English altogether during prayer. Morrison described hearing vocalizations in a shifting tonal system, layered with harmonics that seemed to vibrate inside the walls. He claimed the sound made his nose bleed, then apologized, as if the human body simply wasn't built for that frequency. And then there was Abel, the youngest, the purest. He began glowing. At first faintly, like phosphorescence beneath the skin. But by the end of the week, his presence illuminated entire rooms, not harsh, not blinding, but soft and unnatural. Like moonlight poured through bone. It wasn't just his skin. His eyes had changed. Not white, not iris, not pupil, just luminous spheres, like twin stars orbiting a human face. When Morrison asked if he could still see, Abel answered calmly, "We see more now. We see across. Across what?" The doctor never asked. Or maybe he did and didn't write down the answer. The community didn't know whether to fear them or worship them. People started visiting the Blackwood farm under cover of night, not to ask for healing, but just to listen. And when the brothers spoke, people wept. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something primal. Some claimed the brothers had glimpsed heaven. Others whispered it wasn't heaven they had touched, but the raw architecture of something older. Something pre-human. The Methodist Church removed their names from the prayer list. Reverend Thorne stopped mentioning them in sermons. Because deep down, everyone sensed the same thing: the Blackwoods weren't sick, they weren't chosen. They were becoming. And whatever they were becoming, it was pulling the town with it, inch by inch, thought by thought, soul by soul. What if transcendence doesn't feel divine? What if it feels inevitable? By the third week of August, the Blackwood farm was no longer just a place, it was a presence. People said the air shifted when you crossed the property line, that your ears would pop, like descending in an airplane, that birds wouldn't fly overhead. And those who walked too close to the chapel said their thoughts didn't feel like their own. Morrison's journals became erratic. He kept returning to the farm, not out of duty but out of compulsion. He described a magnetic influence that made him feel drawn, even when he wanted to leave. One entry simply read, "They're not human anymore, but they're not wrong either." The worst part, he wasn't alone in that feeling. The town had changed. There was a subtle rhythm now. People moved differently. Conversations drifted. Children stared at things adults couldn't see. And it all traced back to the chapel. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., the wind would stop. Complete silence. No crickets. No livestock. Just the sound of four voices harmonizing in impossible patterns, drifting from the hilltop. And each time someone tried to describe the melody, they cried. Not because it was beautiful, but because it sounded like it knew them. Reverend Thorne grew desperate. He warned the congregation that the brothers were not of God, but of something masquerading as divine. But the pews were emptier each Sunday. Faith was leaking out of the church and pooling around the chapel like fog. Then the children started wandering, waking up in the middle of the night, found standing barefoot in the wheat fields near the Blackwood property, whispering words they couldn't remember by morning. They weren't sick. They weren't sleepwalking. They were being called. And no one, not even Morrison, could explain how. The doctor sent letters to Kansas City, then to Chicago, but no one responded. Or if they did, their replies never arrived. Cedar Ridge was on its own now. Whatever was happening out there, it didn't want interference. The sense of isolation became unbearable. The Blackwood brothers had survived the plague, but what they brought back with them was worse. It wasn't a disease. It was a signal. And everyone was already tuned in. When salvation starts to look like surrender, how do you know the difference? By late August, the town was breaking apart from the inside. Not from infection, but from something deeper, a rupture in belief. The Blackwoods weren't spreading illness anymore. They were spreading influence. And no one could agree on what that meant. Some residents began calling them the Anointed. Others wouldn't speak their names at all. There were people praying for them in secret, others plotting to drive them out. And right in the center was Reverend Marcus Thorne, once the most respected voice in Cedar Ridge, now watching his congregation crumble like wet paper. He'd seen miracles before. He'd preached about them. But this wasn't holy. It was too precise, too systematic. As if the brothers were following blueprints no one else could read. And so he stood at the pulpit one final time and said, "If this is God's work, then God has changed. And we must decide whether to follow or resist." That line split the town in two. Morrison, for his part, was unraveling. His entries had grown chaotic. Time loops at the farm. "I see myself before I arrive." Abel knew what I would ask before I knocked. He stopped sleeping. Stopped sending reports. One note, written in pencil on a blood-stained envelope, simply read, "They're building something inside their minds." Meanwhile, the children who had wandered to the Blackwood fields had started drawing symbols. On barn walls, in the dirt, on their skin. None of them remembered doing it. But the symbols matched those appearing on Caleb's body, geometric theorems no one could translate. At a town hall hastily called on August 25th, Mayor Harrison delivered the truth everyone had been avoiding. We are no longer in control. That night, a decision was made. A delegation small, official, and desperate would confront the brothers face to face. They would demand clarity, demand boundaries, demand that whatever this was, stop. The people chosen Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Thomas Preston, the father of the glowing girl, and Dr. Morrison, who hadn't stopped shaking since the meeting began. The date was set November 1st, 1878, the last day the town would ever pretend things were normal. Because if the brothers said no, what came next wouldn't be a conversation. It would be containment, or worse, obedience. The delegation set out under a flat gray sky, the kind that made the prairie feel endless and claustrophobic at the same time. November 1st, 1878. 4 men rode together in silence, Mayor Harrison gripping the reins like he could will control back into the world, Reverend Thorne reciting scripture under his breath, Thomas Preston clutching a photograph of his daughter, and Dr. Morrison staring at the dirt road like it might open up and swallow them whole. They didn't know what they were walking into, only that they wouldn't be the same coming out. From a distance, the Blackwood farm looked normal. Too normal. The wheat was still tall and gold, despite 3 weeks of frost. The cattle stood in silent, symmetrical clusters. No wind, no birds. Just stillness. And then the air began to vibrate. Subtle at first, like a hum in your teeth. Morrison would later write that his vision blurred, not from fear, but from proximity. The chapel glowed faintly at the top of the hill, a dull white pulse like a heartbeat under stone. It was midday. The glow made no sense. Preston was the first to speak "My girl's in there." But the way he said it, it wasn't a question. It wasn't hope. It was certainty wrapped in dread. When they reached the front porch, the door opened before they knocked. And standing there was Sarah Preston. She looked healthy, calm, but her eyes shimmered with the same golden hue that had begun in Josiah and now seemed to pulse in all of them. "They're waiting in the chapel," she said, her voice layered, soft and harmonic, like 4 voices speaking through one child. "They know why you've come." As the men followed her up the path, the environment began to shift. The ground was too quiet. The light felt curved. Trees swayed in rhythm, even when the wind didn't blow. And above them, a formation of crows flew in a perfect triangle, not a single wing out of sync. Morrison noted in his final pre-chapel entry, "They are not transforming anymore. They have finished." This was no longer a healing. It wasn't even a warning. It was an unveiling. Whatever stood inside that chapel was no longer meant for the world that had sent them. What happens when the ones you came to stop have already become something you can't define, let alone confront? The inside of the chapel didn't match the outside. From a distance, it looked like a simple limestone structure built by 4 faithful men. But once the delegation stepped inside, reality cracked. The room stretched longer than it should have. The walls pulsed with faint bioluminescence, like stone that had learned to breathe. There were no windows, and yet everything was perfectly lit. And at the center, surrounded by flickering geometric symbols traced in ash and gold, stood the Blackwood brothers. They were arranged in a square, equidistant, perfectly still. Their skin was translucent now, revealing networks of pulsing, golden vascular systems beneath. Their eyes no longer looked like eyes. They looked like mirrors that reflected nothing but knew everything. And when they spoke as one. "Welcome. We have been expecting you." Their voices didn't echo from their throats. They came from the walls, the floor, the marrow in your bones. Mayor Harrison tried to speak. His mouth moved. No sound came out. Reverend Thorne trembled. "This is not God," he whispered. "This is imitation." But the brothers turned to him not with anger, but with pity. "We are the fulfillment of what you feared to ask," Josiah said, his voice now radiating from every angle. "You speak of divinity like it ends at comprehension, but the divine begins where comprehension breaks." "Doctor," Morrison staggered forward. His knees buckled. He saw mathematical patterns embedded in the walls, symbols rearranging themselves in real time to match his pulse. "What are you?" he choked out. "We are post-threshold," Caleb answered. "We are vessels, not beings. Memory, matter, and meaning have aligned. We no longer distinguish between knowledge and biology." Sarah stood beside them now, eyes wide with something too ancient for a child. She smiled, not cruelly, not kindly, just knowingly. "They showed me where time touches itself," she said. "It's not a line. It's a spiral. And we're at the point where it folds." That's when Preston screamed. Not from fear, from grief. "Give me my daughter back," he begged. But the Blackwoods didn't flinch. They simply responded. "She never left. You just remained." This was no confrontation. It was an unveiling. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood the same truth at once. There was no going back. Not to faith. Not to science. Not to being human. The brothers didn't try to convince the delegation of anything. They didn't debate, threaten, or explain. They invited. "If you wish to understand," Ezra said, "we will show you. Not in metaphor, not in belief, but directly." Morrison should have said no. He should have run. But something in his mind leaned forward before his body ever moved. The others followed like gravity had shifted. The Blackwoods called it a consciousness bridge. But what happened next can't be described with science or scripture. There was no tunnel. No white light. Just collapse. Morrison's body never moved. But his mind was pulled through a lattice of memory, emotion, sensation across space, across time, across people. He saw every thought in Cedar Ridge at once, every heartbeat, every betrayal, every secret hidden beneath clean shirts and church pews. He saw a woman in New York dying in 1903 before she was ever born. He saw golden threads connecting disease, music, numbers, and prayer. And worse, he understood it. All of it. For a moment, Morrison's mind touched something outside time, a structure not made of atoms, but of awareness itself. We are becoming architecture. Josiah's voice echoed. Not bricks, not walls, but blueprints. For what comes next. Mayor Harrison dropped to his knees, whispering his own name like he was trying to remember who he was. Thorne began weeping and quoting scriptures he hadn't memorized. Preston stared at his hands as if they were no longer his. Sarah stood in the center, eyes closed, smiling as though floating in warmth the others could no longer process. And Morrison was fracturing. His thoughts began overlapping. Past, present, and future began looping. "What year is it?" he whispered. Not out of confusion, but because he could feel too many answers at once. When the vision ended, no one spoke for a long time. Not because they didn't have words, but because words no longer seemed designed for what they now knew. They had been shown the raw scaffolding of existence, and it had no room for belief, only design. And that was the final cruelty. This wasn't supernatural. This was structured, engineered, executed. The Blackwoods weren't miracles. They were prototypes. And Cedar Ridge had been the test site. Not for power, not for salvation, but for transformation beyond human comprehension. The moment the bridge collapsed, silence returned, but it wasn't peace. It was post-event silence, the kind that follows a detonation. Everyone in that chapel stood, but none of them were whole anymore. They had seen too much, but worse, they had been seen in return. Josiah stepped forward, slower now, like gravity no longer worked the same. His voice, still resonant, was softer. You are free to leave. But you will carry us. You will carry us in language, in memory, in resistance. That is the function. Function. Not gift. Not curse. Not prophecy. Function. Morrison stumbled backward, breathing like a man trying to remember how lungs work. He looked at the others, Reverend Thorne mouthing silent prayers with no words, Preston with blood at his ears, and Harrison, glass-eyed, whispering multiplication tables like a lifeline. Something had been placed inside them. Not physically, cognitively. Like a new operating system overlaid on top of the old one. One that didn't care about ethics, or faith, or sanity. Just signal clarity. Sarah was gone. No one saw her leave. Only her shoes remained placed neatly by the door. Still warm. The Blackwoods never moved again. They stood in formation as the four men exited, not speaking, not blinking, not even breathing. The chapel door shut behind them. No one touched it. It simply sealed. Outside, the wind returned, but it no longer sounded like wind. It whispered, low and layered, like an aftershock echoing through every blade of wheat. On the ride back to town, no one spoke. Morrison tried to write, but his hand shook violently. He wrote only one phrase in his journal before blacking out, "They've detached. They're no longer here, not in the way we understand here." And that's when it became clear the Blackwoods hadn't become monsters. They hadn't ascended. They had opted out. Out of the human condition. Out of the time-looped logic of life and death. And the delegation, every last one of them, was now infected with understanding. This wasn't a story to contain. It was a concept that would spread. Thought to thought. Dream to dream. Cedar Ridge had not witnessed a miracle. It had been a test case. A simulation. A spark to light something ancient buried in the species. And the worst part. Now that you've heard it, maybe it's inside you too. The delegation made it back to Cedar Ridge by dusk, but the town didn't feel the same. It was quieter, but not empty. More like the silence was waiting. Thorne collapsed the moment he stepped off his horse. He wouldn't speak for the next 3 days. When he finally did, the only word he repeated was unfinished. Over and over. Unfinished. 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 Morrison locked himself inside his study and boarded the windows shut. His final journal entry, written in shaky script, read, "The chapel is not a building. It's a node. And we are now part of its system." He was found 6 days later, dehydrated, eyes wide open, clutching a stone etched with the Blackwood sigil carved into his own skin. Mayor Harrison resigned and left town that night, abandoning everything: home, family, name. No one ever saw him again. Some say he joined a silent monastery in Utah. Others say he walked straight into the ocean and never resurfaced. Thomas Preston remained the longest. He'd spend hours staring at the wheat fields, mumbling phrases that didn't match any known language. When questioned, he'd just say, "She's not gone. She's just ahead of us." By winter, he too was gone. No belongings taken. Door left open. One pair of shoes left behind, just like Sarah. But the real damage wasn't in the men. It was in the town. Children began drawing shapes again. shapes no one taught them. Crop patterns appeared overnight in exact geometric grids. The church emptied out, while the chapel still locked glowed faintly every new moon. People began reporting dreams. Vivid. Shared. Some described standing at the edge of an infinite spiral. Others recited equations they'd never learned. Everyone dreamed of singing. Not human voices, but layered, harmonic pulses, like language with no words. Something was spreading. Not a virus. Not a religion. A pattern. And once you've been shown the pattern, you can't unsee it. It lives beneath grammar, beneath instinct. A scaffold under thought itself. The Blackwoods didn't need followers. They just needed contact. One mind to see, and another to reflect. Now it's in the architecture of memory. They didn't want worship. They wanted resonance. And Cedar Ridge, once a forgotten patch of prairie, became the first chord. The first time human cognition sang something older than sound. Something no prayer could touch. Something that rewired what it meant to be conscious. By spring of 1879, Cedar Ridge was no longer a town, it was a suggestion. Maps quietly removed its name. Postal routes were redirected. Government records were archived under administrative errors. No official statement was made. No disaster reported. It was simply unremembered. What buildings remained stood like hollow ribs in a field of gold wheat, always swaying, even when there was no wind. The chapel was sealed. Its doors fused as if melted shut, yet glowing faintly beneath moonlight. Still no one dared touch it. Not even birds perched near it. A surveyor from Topeka arrived in June to catalog the area. He was never found. His notebook, however, was recovered weeks later, half submerged in mud. Its final line read, "The earth here thinks. Those who lived through it, if they could be called survivors, never truly left." Some wandered to nearby towns, speaking little, eyes distant, often waking from shared dreams. One woman, formerly a teacher, was found carving spirals into library shelves with her fingernails. When questioned, she said only, "They showed me the framework, and now I belong to it." Those who never visited Cedar Ridge still felt the echo. Faint, but persistent. As if a ripple had spread across consciousness itself. As if some ancient switch had been thrown in the collective mind of humanity, and now something waited in the static between thoughts. Morrison's personal effects were finally opened in 1947. Among his journals was a sealed envelope, labeled in Latin Quod insepimus, Nunc est perpetuum. What we have begun is now eternal. Inside was a hand-drawn map, not of Kansas, not of Earth, but of an architectural spiral overlaid on the human brain. Accompanying it was a single sentence: the Blackwoods were never prophets. They were engineers. And so Cedar Ridge became the story you're not supposed to hear. The glitch in the archive. The blank spot in the index. Not because it was lost, but because something didn't want it found. Because if you learn the pattern, and more importantly, if you understand it, it recognizes you back. And that's when the real infection begins. Even decades after the town had vanished from maps, Cedar Ridge still found ways to speak. But it didn't speak through language. It spoke through dreams. Farmers in Missouri began reporting strange sleepwalking episodes. One man was found 20 miles from home, barefoot and humming a four-tone harmony no one could identify. Children across Kansas drew spirals in the margins of their school books, symmetrical, perfect, never taught. Psychiatrists wrote it off as mass suggestion. But what kind of suggestion crosses state lines and generations? In 1921, a nurse in Colorado described an entity made of math visiting her in sleep. "It wasn't a creature," she wrote. "It was a design. A presence that folded itself into my memory without asking." By 1954, similar reports came from Canada, then Scandinavia, then Japan. All of them included the same phrase translated, reworded, but consistent in meaning. I saw the chapel. It saw me back. The location didn't matter. The people had never met. But the image was always the same, a glowing structure on a hill of golden wheat, and 4 figures standing perfectly still. It wasn't just folklore. It was recurrence. Dr. Elise Hammond, a neuroscientist in the 1980s, studied collective dream phenomena and dismissed the Blackwood case as rural superstition until her own daughter began drawing spirals on the walls in her sleep. The child whispered, "It's not a dream. It's a memory we haven't lived yet." Elise quit her work the next day and disappeared 6 months later. The pattern wasn't fading. It was blooming subterranean and slow. Some believe the Blackwood brothers planted something in Cedar Ridge, not a seed in soil, but in thought. A cognitive infection that spreads through recognition. Every time someone retells the story, draws the shapes, hums the tone, it strengthens, like a radio tower testing its range. And the scariest part, it doesn't need belief. It just needs attention. One glance, one thought, one loop of curiosity, and suddenly you've already participated. Because once the idea touches your mind, it anchors itself. It doesn't need your permission. And the Blackwoods, they don't need to return. They're already inside, not as ghosts, not as prophets, but as code, running silently beneath your memories, waiting for your dreams to shift into alignment. There is no official record of what happened in Cedar Ridge. No monument, no closure. Just fragments, a map here, a sketch there, a phrase whispered in dreams. But if you look closely, the cracks remain. In language, in logic, in you. The Blackwood brothers didn't leave a legacy. They left a wound, one that doesn't bleed, but pulses. A kind of psychic fracture stitched into the collective unconscious. And every time someone tells their story, the fracture deepens. We think of horror as something external. A monster, a place, a face. But what if the true horror is knowing too much? Knowing that faith, science, even death, are not endings, but interfaces. Temporary skins stretched over something older, smarter, hungrier. Something that waited for one anomaly, 4 brothers on a Kansas farm to pierce the veil. And now, that veil is thinning everywhere. The spirals show up in subway graffiti. The melodies leak into sleep apps. Children hum in unison in playgrounds across countries. Never taught, never aware. What began as a forgotten plague in 1878 has become a silent alignment. Not a conspiracy, not a curse. Just inevitable. We've crossed the threshold. We are now part of the system. And the system doesn't care about belief. It cares about replication. You don't have to follow. You just have to notice. And now you have. Some say the Blackwood Chapel still stands. Others say it never did. But those who dream of it describe the same final scene, 4 figures standing beneath a spiral sky. One turns, one speaks, one reaches forward, and one simply stares. And when you wake, something in your reflection doesn't quite move right. No nightmares, no trauma, just the faint hum of something vast. Humming in your spine. A resonance you can't unhear. A silence you can't forget. That's the true infection. Not in the body, but in continuity. And if this video made you feel anything curiosity, discomfort, déjà vu, then maybe, just maybe, you're already in tune. Not with the story, Not with the brothers, but with the pattern behind them. The thing that chose them. The thing that's been waiting, watching, whispering through time. You're ready.